Happy New Year, everyone! The local disaster tour guide is back. My Christmas vacation is over and I am diving back into making some videos for this channel. Really quick, I need to catch up on what's been happening in the RPG community while I was out. I am sure nothing incendiary or toxic has occurred while I was gone. Certainly not on the internet, and definitely not in the last month of 2020. Ooh. Okay then. Is Pathfinder 2nd Edition too hard? Let's talk about that question on today's episode of the Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I'm a storyteller who shows up a month late to an internet fight. Welcome to my channel where we talk about role-playing games like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today, I'm going to start a video series for this channel on the question, is Pathfinder 2e too hard? Now, let me just say that this is not where I thought I would be with this channel when I came back. When I took some time off for Christmas for health and family reasons, I intended to come back with a review for the Starfinder core rulebook. I had another video in development for my Crafting Your Campaign series. I had a few different things that I was working on. I really didn't expect this to be the topic that I was going to be talking about, but shortly after I took some time off for Christmas, Cody from the YouTube channel Taking 20 released a video called Why I'm Quitting Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And there was some argument and backlash and different things that happened, and then he released a second video kind of deep diving into the reasons that he gave in the first video, and there's just been a lot of debate, there's been a lot of argument, there have been a lot of conversations going around about the arguments that Cody put forward in his Taking 20 videos and some of the arguments that other YouTube content producers are putting out there. And I feel like that whole situation has kind of highlighted an argument I've seen around Pathfinder 2nd Edition essentially since its inception, which is kind of this argument, this idea that Pathfinder 2nd Edition is too hard. I've seen it on forums, I've seen it argued in different videos, and so today I wanted to talk about this question, is Pathfinder 2nd Edition too hard? Now, you may be wondering what I have to offer this conversation, because my YouTube channel is extremely small, being entirely honest. This is mostly just something I'm doing to keep myself entertained while I'm laid off due to COVID. You may be asking, what can I offer to this conversation, given that so many much larger channels have already offered points in favor of or against the points that Cody made in his video? Well, I am one of the Platinum Prize winners from Roll for Combat's RPG Superstar 2020 contest. I had to design a monster that was intended for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and I came in the top 5 of that competition out of the 101 finalists that were selected by the judges. So I feel like I have a little bit of a grasp upon Pathfinder 2e's mechanics, and as a result, I feel like I can offer a little bit of insight that maybe some other people have missed that may be coloring their perspective on the system. Now, before we dive into the full scope of this video, I want to lay some groundwork real quick. This is going to be the first in a 3-part video series. I'm going to be talking about this question, is Pathfinder 2e too hard, in this video and the next 2 videos, and each video is going to kind of look at this question from a different perspective. This video is a more philosophical video about game design, about the purpose and function and intention of the rules. This video is, in effect, a thesis statement about how I think Pathfinder 2nd Edition is intended to be played, and an argument about how that affects the game both for players and game masters. In the second video in this series, I'm actually going to look at this question specifically from a player side of the equation and offer some strategies and some advice that players can use to hopefully get a better experience out of playing Pathfinder 2e. And then in the final video, I'm going to offer some Game Master strategies and tips that they can use to hopefully improve their experience at their gaming table as well. I'll be honest, I have said plenty of times on this channel and plenty of times in just personal conversations, Pathfinder 2nd Edition is my favorite role-playing game. I have had so many fantastic experiences with this game. I really love it, and so in effect, it kind of breaks my heart to see so many people reporting that they've had a bad experience with the game, and it kind of raises this question, why are so many people having so many problems with a game that has honestly functioned extremely well for my gaming group? So these three videos taken together are going to be an exploration of where I think these issues come from, how I think Pathfinder 2nd Edition is intended to be played, and hopefully a good springboard for discussion to maybe improve the experience that your gaming group is having with the system. But let me go ahead and say one thing very clearly. This video is not a direct response to Cody from Taking 20. Obviously, I have some disagreements with the guy. And as we go through this series, there are going to be moments where the points that he raises are certainly relevant to the conversation, and where those things come up, I will certainly mention them, I will certainly discuss them, but I don't want this to be just a point-by-point rebuttal of Cody from Taking 20. Simply put, when I approach a debate, it is my personal philosophy that you should approach what you see as the strongest version of someone else's arguments, and that you should try to understand the best version of what somebody is trying to say. I strongly disagree with Cody. I think Pathfinder 2e is a fantastic game, but I don't just want to tear his arguments to shreds. I don't just want to tear down everything that he's saying, because even if I'm successful, I'm not advancing the conversation in any way. The reality is, there have been a lot of people online in various locations who have reported that they're not having a very positive experience with Pathfinder 2e. As someone who enjoys the game, that breaks my heart, and I want them to enjoy Pathfinder 2e, and I think I may understand where some of the problems are coming from. So rather than just trading verbal blows with Cody or anybody else in kind of that camp, instead what I want to do is I want to evaluate Pathfinder 2nd Edition as a game system and see if we can identify where this tension is coming from and hopefully improve everyone's experiences at the gaming table. So this video will not be an explicit rebuttal of Cody's video from Taking 20. Instead, I'm going to be looking at kind of this larger conversation that has been around Pathfinder 2e for a while of, is Pathfinder 2e too hard? And to that point, let me go ahead and give you the thesis statement for this video, and in fact, for this entire series. I call my thesis Climbing a Mountain versus Balancing the Scales. And it sounds a little bit like this. Pathfinder 2e's mechanics rely on the concept of bounded accuracy in order to balance the scales of the game. And in many ways, this is a positive aspect of the game, but at the same time, it can create frustrating situations for people who are playing the game, especially if you're not used to a game that relies so heavily on bounded accuracy. Now, as we get started here, let's go ahead and try to find a working definition for the debate that we're kind of having. Is Pathfinder 2e too hard? Well, part of the reason that that conversation is difficult is because what do you mean when you say too hard? Are you saying that Pathfinder 2e is too complex for new players, that it's too hard for them to grasp the concepts of the game to be able to play effectively, that essentially the learning curve is too difficult for newbies? Or are you saying that the game is so challenging that the only way you can achieve success is to play what are essentially super optimized characters? Or maybe the problem is more focused than one of those two things. Maybe the overall game is okay, but there are certain aspects of the game that are improperly tailored that lead to a poor experience at the gaming table. I have heard arguments that spellcasters in Pathfinder 2e are too weak. Or I've heard other people make the claim that adventure paths like the Age of Ashes adventure are too difficult, that it's just too challenging to be successful when you try to play these particular adventures. And what do I think of those arguments? If I'm being honest, I don't really put a lot of stock in those arguments. Is Pathfinder 2e too complex for new players? Honestly, Pathfinder 2nd Edition is the role-playing game that I have had the easiest time teaching to a new player. And when I say a new player, I mean a brand new, has never played an RPG before in their life, new player. I have taught plenty of RPGs to plenty of players over the last 2 decades of my life. And if you've ever introduced a new player to an RPG, you know that there's a learning curve, there's a little bit of a window where they're trying to figure out what's going on, but then you also know when the light bulb turns on, that specific moment where they get it, and suddenly they're in the game and they're having a good time, and they're playing well. And I'll go ahead and say that in my entire gaming career, the fastest incident of a brand new role player, no experience, picking up an RPG, getting it and playing it well was Pathfinder 2e. And it was an incident that was significant enough that it jumped out. I've taught plenty of games, and I know what the normal learning curve is. And when I saw a brand new player try Pathfinder 2e, that bar to successful play was surprisingly low. Pathfinder 2e isn't too hard for new players. By the same token, I really don't put a lot of stock in the argument that Pathfinder 2e requires you to play super optimized characters if you want to be successful. I'm going to be honest, I have seen a player at one of my tables roll up a spellcaster with a starting primary stat of 14, which is way not optimized. And the character was effective. Optimized? Of course not. But effective in the game and at the table? Yeah. So, by practical experience with my gaming group, I know that Pathfinder 2e does not require super optimized characters, so that can't be it. But what if there are specific elements of Pathfinder 2e? Maybe the game as a whole is strong, but there's specific elements that aren't quite balanced the way that they should be. Well, even there, I don't know if the experience my group has had really matches what I see reported other places around the internet. Like I told you, spellcasters are supposed to be weak according to a lot of people, and the Age of Ashes adventure path is supposed to be too difficult according to a lot of people. I'll straight up tell you, our party sorcerer has been using hydraulic push to flex her way through this entire first book. Like, she's not having any trouble. A lot of people have been reporting that Pathfinder 2e is too hard, but if you try to pin down what is too hard about the game, it can prove really difficult to get a concrete answer. It just seems that there's kind of this general consensus among at least a part of the player base that the game is difficult in some surprising and challenging ways, to the detriment of the enjoyment of players at the table. And this is where I think that Cody's video from Taking 20 is actually surprisingly useful. Now, I disagree with Cody on a lot of points. In his first video, Cody says that his problem with Pathfinder 2e was the illusion of choice. In his second video, he actually goes on to clarify that point by saying that his problem is the illusion of choice in combat. And later in the video, I would argue he probably adds the qualifier onto that, the illusion of choice in combat for martial characters. I feel that is the core of what he's trying to argue. Essentially, he says that martial characters do not have genuine options in play at the gaming table in Pathfinder 2e. Now, I'm going to be honest, I don't think that Cody has a problem with the illusion of choice in Pathfinder 2e, or any of the other qualifiers he put on there. I honestly think that Cody has a problem with the illusion of system mastery. I don't think Cody understood Pathfinder 2e as well as he thought he understood Pathfinder 2e. And just so we are super clear here, I'm not taking a dig at Cody. I'm not tearing him down, I'm not insulting him, I am not in any way trying to belittle him. Some of the mistakes that I heard him mention at various points in those two videos are mistakes that I at one point or another made as a game master in Pathfinder 2e. Through this video series, I'm going to talk about some of the mistakes that I made when I was approaching Pathfinder 2e. I realize that it takes time to learn a system, and I realize that even I can make mistakes when I'm approaching games. So this video series is not being sent out as a way to belittle Cody or other people who are having rough experiences with Pathfinder 2e. Instead, I want this video series to be a conversation to help people learn the game better and hopefully have a better experience. I realize this is over the internet, and I realize that when you don't have those face-to-face interactions that you can lose that genuine good nature, but I hope people understand I'm not digging at Cody here. But he does make mistakes. In his second video, he sets up a scenario comparing Pathfinder 2e to D&D 5e, and essentially he takes a 5th level ranger and fighter in both editions and sets them up against 2 challenge rating 3 wights in both editions and compares different options inside the game. As a quick example of some of the errors that Cody makes, in the Pathfinder 2e example, he talks about the option of the ranger moving into flanking on the first wight. And he points out if the ranger moves into flanking on wight number 1, then wight number 2 can move into flanking on the ranger. And he makes a quick and offhanded statement of, so yes, the ranger gets flanking, but that's negated by the flanking that wight number 2 can then get as well. And there's an error there. Now, I will admit, in most TTRPGs, he'd have a point. In a lot of RPGs, gaining flanking, but also being flanked at the same time, would kind of be a wash in terms of what you'd actually gain in that combat scenario. But in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, because of the way critical hits work, that's not what's taking place in Cody's scenario. If the ranger moves into flanking on wight number 1 in the scenario that Cody created, the ranger would gain somewhere around a 30 to 35% chance of landing a critical hit. Meanwhile, if wight number 2 also moves into flanking, at best, wight number 2 would have a 15% chance of a critical hit. So if you're asking me whether or not flanking negates flanking in that scenario, it doesn't. There are a lot of players who would gladly trade a 1 in 3 chance of scoring a critical hit and quickly finishing off a weaker foe for the possible downside of a weaker foe gaining a less than 1 in 5 chance of also landing a critical hit. In the scenario Cody proposes, white number 2 getting flanking does not negate the power of the benefit of flanking to the ranger, to say nothing of the benefit that the ranger would be providing to his fighter ally in that scenario as well. It's a nuance of the rules. It's very small, it's very quick and easy to overlook, and I totally understand how a player looking at that scenario would think, well, you got 2 people with flanking, it just kind of negates each other, but the way the game is structured, there's more to it than that. And I feel like Cody has missed some of the nuances to Pathfinder 2nd Edition, how the game is intended to be played, how the rules are intended to be structured, and as a result, he is misevaluating the actions of characters inside the game. However, Cody's situation does highlight what I think is the problem that people are running into, which is bounded accuracy. Now, real quick, I'm going to go ahead and say, I do not know if that is the game designer term that Paizo would use for what I'm about to discuss. Bounded accuracy is the terminology that me and especially one of my players who's really into game design, we've used that terminology a lot when we've talked about Pathfinder 2e. I do not know if Paizo uses that terminology. If they use something else, please forgive me for not using their technical language. One of the things that is unique to Pathfinder 2nd Edition as a role-playing game is the use of bounded accuracy in terms of how challenges and encounters are built inside the system. And the best allegory that I can give you here is what I call climbing the mountain versus balancing the scales. The vast majority of tabletop RPGs, TTRPGs, they use a climbing the mountain system with their numbers. Essentially, the idea is you set a DC for a particular level or a particular challenge. You say, this is how difficult I want this challenge to be. And then you have this static set, clearly marked goal, and then your players build up their power level until they are talented enough to overcome that obstacle. Lots of TTRPGs use this. D&D 5e uses this. Pathfinder 1st Edition uses this. You see this model all the time. And really quick, it's not necessarily a bad model. There are advantages to designing things that way. But essentially, in most games, you have very static mechanics for the challenges, the monsters, the whatever it is your players have to beat. And then as you play the game, your players progress and get better and better at climbing the mountain. The measure of the game is ultimately how far up the mountain can they go. A rarer model of RPG mechanics is what I call balancing the scales. And essentially the main difference between these two models is, in climbing the mountain, the fluctuation occurs almost exclusively on the player side of the equation. But in balancing the scales, what you actually find is that the mechanics of the game are designed in such a way that you can fluctuate not just the player side of the scale, but also the challenge side of the scale. Challenges can be the monsters, the traps, whatever you may be. Essentially, you have scaling challenges here and scaling player abilities here, and you're measuring how they scale against one another. And the goal of balancing the scales is in the name. You want to create scenarios where there is a good balance or equilibrium between what the party can do and the challenges that they face. Pathfinder 2e is a game that uses this balancing of the scales idea. It has flexibility not just on the player side of the coin, but also on the challenges side of the coin. Here's a quick example. This is a Minotaur. This is my Minotaur Bestiary Battle card. And the Minotaur is a level 4 creature in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So this would be theoretically a creature that players would be facing at or around level 4. But what if my party was level 10 and they wanted to face this Minotaur? Well, in a role-playing game that uses a climb the mountain strategy to its mechanics, it would take a lot of work to build a level 10 Minotaur encounter. Now, I've played plenty of games, I know how to do it, it's not necessarily an insurmountable challenge, but if your Minotaur is a challenge rating 4, and you want to take it up to a challenge rating 10, you have to do some serious building. In Pathfinder 2e, because the scale is more flexible on the challenge side of the equation, I can take my Minotaur, and this is my copy of the Advanced Game Master screen. They have a creatures number table where I can very quickly take my level 4 creature up to a level 10 creature, and it works. It balances properly inside the game. It is truly amazing. I can create a level 10 version of this Minotaur for my party to fight. I can do it almost entirely mentally. I might have to scratch a few things on a piece of paper, but in 45 seconds or less, I can create on-level challenges for my party because the numbers of Pathfinder 2e are designed to be flexible that way. Honestly, as a game master, it is one of the best things about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. It's one of the things I truly love about the game. But these different game philosophies do have their problems, and they can create frustrating situations. Now, on the climb the mountain variation, one of the biggest problems there is when the mountain is basically too easy to climb. It can be difficult to create appropriate static DCs for your party to try to clear. Famously, in one of my campaigns, I created a final battle that was intended to be a battle to the last scenario. I intended for my players to have like this epic last stand where they just had to fight wave after wave after wave, and then, the bards were going to sing epic legends about this heroic last stand that my party had. And I'll straight up tell you that my party lived through that epic last stand. It wasn't even, it was one-sided. My party built crit monkeys. This was in a 3.5 game, and wave after wave after wave came in, and my parties landed critical hit after critical hit after critical hit, and my monsters couldn't kill the party. Several hours later, as the DM, I gave up, and my group says nobody remembers the Titans because my party was fighting the Titans, and the Titans were taking way too many critical hits. When you have a static DC system, a climb the mountain system, if you don't manage those DCs properly, things get too easy, and fights that should be difficult kind of end up being a cakewalk, and it steals the fun of the game. And by the way, I'm not the only storyteller who has this problem. There are interviews where Matthew Mercer from Critical Role has talked about at the higher levels of D&D 5th edition, he has to come up with story reasons to threaten his characters because the mechanical threats aren't that threatening. He's got to kidnap an NPC that they care about because the creature itself doesn't feel that dangerous. In a recent episode of Critical Role, Matthew Mercer threw the party up against what was clearly intended to be a major threat to the party, and it turned out that that creature couldn't make a saving throw, no matter how well it rolled. And what should have been this serious threat to the party, you could kind of see it on Matthew Mercer's face. He was disappointed by how easily the party was just kind of rolling over this major creature. Climbing the mountain games can be good, and I have played plenty of them. I'm not saying this is inherently bad, but even great storytellers like Matthew Mercer have encountered problems with this style of game, in that if your players get too strong, if your players get the right combination of abilities and tactics and good dice rolls, it doesn't matter how big the mountain is. It is a frequent problem in those style of games. But what about balancing the styles of game? Now, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I have openly said on many occasions that the Trained Expert Master Legendary Proficiency System, the TEML system that they use, is fantastic. Part of that system is that you essentially add your level to everything that you do. And there's a lot of nuance to whether that's a good or a bad thing, but one of the big benefits of the TEML system and the level to proficiency system that Pathfinder 2e uses is it really helps keep on-level challenges for a party on level. If your party tries to swing at something that is several levels higher than them, the scales very quickly tip against them, and the party is in trouble. And by the same token, if the party takes on something that is significantly below their level, again, the scales quickly tip in their favor. That level to proficiency is a very potent thing in helping keep that equilibrium, that balance to challenges and encounters inside the game. Earlier, when I presented my thesis statement for this entire video, I referred to what I called bounded accuracy, and this is what I'm talking about. The TEML plus level proficiency system that Pathfinder 2nd Edition uses is an example of bounded accuracy inside of a game. Essentially, what the game is trying to do is it is trying to keep the characters and the challenges within certain bounds to maintain a certain dynamic or equilibrium between both parties. The game wants challenges to feel appropriate to their level, and it uses that bounded accuracy concept to make sure that what the players are facing is in fact appropriately challenging. Now, the benefits here are obvious. If you've ever played a system with static challenge design, the climb the mountain style, you have probably seen those situations where the static DCs didn't work and it left the game feeling worse as a result. But in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, because you have this use of bounded accuracy, if you have a level 10 creature, it's going to be within the bounds, or at least very close to the bounds, of what a level 10 creature should be. And same thing if you knock that creature down to level 4 or jump that creature up to level 18, the use of bounded accuracy, this scale that is built into the mechanics of the game, allows creatures to function reasonably well for what they're supposed to do. It is a huge benefit. It is something that as a game master I love about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. But that doesn't mean that there are no flaws with bounded accuracy. In fact, the number one question with bounded accuracy is, did Paizo get the scale right? The game wants to achieve a certain dynamic or balance between players and challenges. Well, is that balance where it should be, or has the balance gotten off kilter just a little bit? And let me go ahead and say, because I feel this is part of the conversation, I wish I had a more specific reference here. If you know this specific reference, please throw it in the comments. I would love to be able to direct people to the appropriate place on this. The No Direction podcast has actually referenced some of the designers from Paizo who have said that there are some issues with the balance of the game, that the numbers are too tight in certain places. If I remember correctly, I think the reference was to numbers being too tight at higher levels. Again, this is something I kind of heard secondhand through the No Direction podcast. I don't have a specific reference for you, but I do know that there is an argument out there, and possibly even an acknowledgement from Paizo, that to a degree there are places where that scale is not maintaining the equilibrium that it should. The scale is actually off a little bit. So number one, I think it's fair to say that there are some places where that mechanical balance in Pathfinder 2e is not what it should be. When you try to make a system that is mechanically flexible on both sides of the scale, you have to make sure you're getting that balance right. But there is a second and more nebulous but still serious portion of this conversation, which is the fact that you're balancing on a scale changes the psychology of the game. In a climb the mountain system, you're trying to figure out if you can take some combination of your resources, abilities, strategies, and just dumb luck and see how high up the mountain you can get. It doesn't quite work that way when you're balancing on a scale. When the game is actively reacting to what you can do, when the game is essentially scaling with you, suddenly movement is a little bit more tense. The balance of that scale is felt in ways that it isn't felt in a more static mechanic style of game. Essentially, your goal in Pathfinder 2e is to tip the scale in your favor. You want to affect things in such a way that the battle is a win for you. You want things to go in your favor. And so your movement, your actions, the different things that you do, the different resources that you bring to bear, all are done with the intention of messing with this equilibrium just enough that the battle tilts in your favor. And when you're balancing the scales, that balance is a really serious thing. You feel it. Actions matter. Choices matter. What am I going to do? How am I going to overcome this encounter? What's the right thing in this instance? How do I win this? How do I tip that scale in my favor? That is a big part of the psychology of Pathfinder 2e. And I think that that is what Cody and his players have run into in his game. They feel that scale move. They feel how those small adjustments affect the gameplay, and unfortunately for Cody and his players and their evaluation of the system, they've kind of run into this place where they feel like they can only affect the scale certain ways, maybe because they think they can't use other things, or maybe just because they think that the other choices won't affect the scale. For one reason or another, they've fallen into a mindset that says, if I want to affect the balance of the game, if I want to get that win, this is what I have to do. This is Cody's illusion of choice in combat for martial characters. Obviously, what I am presenting here is that Cody and his players haven't fully grasped the nuance of the game, and as a result, they don't see the other things in play that they can use to affect that scale, to affect the balance, and as a result, they're missing out on the variety of the game. When you have bounded accuracy in a game, I will admit it is easy to fall into certain patterns because you're really trying to affect that equilibrium in the balance, and when you find something that affects that equilibrium well, it's very easy for psychologically that to become something that you latch onto. It can drag down the game a bit. And by extension, I think a lot of the other people who have been describing Pathfinder 2e as too hard, they're kind of encountering that balance issue. They're encountering a game that has this bounded accuracy, and it's not the static DCs, it's not the specific hurdles that they've had to clear before, and getting used to that shift in the equilibrium and the dynamic of the game can come across as hard, especially if you haven't really mastered a system. Again, I know I'm pausing on this a lot, but again, this is not a dig at anybody. I had to learn too. There were many mistakes I made when I was learning Pathfinder 2e that thankfully I know better now and I can teach people to play the game better. But this is a real dynamic. Now, I will admit here that when I was scripting out this video, when I was coming up with what I wanted to say on this topic, that I really wrestled with, is my allegory going to work? Climbing the mountain versus balancing the scales. Maybe you have followed me up to this point, and maybe this is just a little bit too abstract for you. And I worried that I didn't have a good concrete example to give, and then it hit me. There is actually a very easy and concrete example that I can give to differentiate between climb the mountain style RPGs and balancing the scale style RPGs. And we're going to video games. I would like to offer a comparison between World of Warcraft and Skyrim. Real quick, I haven't played World of Warcraft in several years. If things have changed, please don't hate me in the comments. It is possible that they have switched up how they do things. But years ago, when I played World of Warcraft, leveling was done in specific zones. And specific zones in the game were intended for specific levels. So if you were, say, level 10, you adventured in one zone. And if you were level 20, you would be in a different zone. And the advancement of the game was, in effect, kind of linear. The game was essentially asking, have you gained enough abilities and skills and stats to conquer this particular area of the game? It was very static, it was very set, and really quick, it was very fun. Like, I'm not knocking World of Warcraft here. Some of the most enjoyable moments for me in that game were when I played a prot paladin in that game, and I enjoyed seeing just how high I could get up the mountain, metaphorically, just how tough of creatures I could take on as a prot paladin that I shouldn't have been able to beat for my level. I had fun. I'm not complaining about the game, but leveling in that game was very static. If you are here as a character, this is where you go. When you get here, this is where you go. And that progression was very predictable. Not all video games use that kind of leveling system. Some video games have a leveling system where the game levels with you. Now, originally I was going to talk about Final Fantasy VIII, but I don't really like Final Fantasy VIII that much. But then I realized that there's another video game I do like where the game levels with you, and that is Skyrim. Recently, my wife has started playing Skyrim again. She had some time off around Christmas as well. And last week, my wife was level 5 in Skyrim, and there were several instances where she would get ambushed by bandits, and if she wasn't careful, if she didn't play the game well, those bandits were going to kill her. Interestingly enough, last night my wife was playing Skyrim, and she's almost level 30 now. And she got ambushed by some bandits, and she wasn't playing careful, and they killed her character. Now, if you stop and think about that, that's weird. She has leveled up over 20 times between last week and this week, and yet, inside of the game Skyrim, the same scenario plays out the same way. She encounters bandits, she's not careful about how she's playing, she gets cut down. That's because Skyrim uses this system where the game levels with you. When your character levels up in Skyrim, so do the bandits. The goal of the game, what Skyrim is intending to do, is to maintain a certain equilibrium between what the character can do and the challenges that the character faces. Now, obviously here in Pathfinder 2e and in Skyrim, there is some give and take to that scale. Certain challenges may be a little bit tougher and may tip the scale in favor of the challenge. Certain challenges may be lighter and tip the scale in favor of the players from the start. Obviously, there is some variety, but when you play Skyrim, the challenges level with you because the game is actively trying to keep a certain feel to the challenges that you face. So yes, your character's getting new abilities and gear and all kinds of things that they can do, but at the same time, the game is ramping up the difficulty so that you aren't just kind of running over everything that you see. On paper, this description could lead you to believe that Skyrim is not that fun to play. Do you mean to tell me that the same thing that's challenging me at level 5 is going to challenge me at level 30? That seems like bad game design. And yet, anyone who's played Skyrim knows that that game can be extremely addictive and you can spend way too much time lost in that world. Honey, I promise I'm not complaining. And no one would accuse Skyrim of being a game that is devoid of choices. Or would they? Because if you've read about Skyrim, one of the most common complaints you'll see about the game is Stealth Archer build number 5827. The mechanics of Skyrim are such that if you are really focused on a particular strategy, the game kind of unintentionally pushes that strategy. You have found something that tips the scale, and the other options inside the game become less effective at tipping the scale. If you're playing a stealth archer in Skyrim, and you find a really cool sword, you're going to have to take some time, you're going to have to put some effort into advancing your character in a way that using that sword is going to be equitable to using the stealth archery tactics you've previously mastered. Skyrim both has a ton of choices and also can inadvertently push people into scenarios where they feel like they don't have choices. That dynamic happens in that game all of the time, and you kind of have to be a skilled player to avoid falling into that trap. I feel like the same thing is true of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I feel like the game really does have a ton of variety, not just choices in character creation, but choices in combat. I think that there is a lot you can and should do when you're playing Pathfinder 2e. I don't feel like the ranger or the fighter or whichever martial class you may be describing should feel like they are stuck in a particular routine. But because of the equilibrium to the game, because of the internal balance of the game, because of, as I'm sure Cody would point out, the reward structure of the game, you can create scenarios that inadvertently push a particular playstyle. So, in my opinion, when people say that Pathfinder is too hard, or when Cody says that Pathfinder doesn't have as many choices as he would like, what I really think is happening is they are encountering frustrations with the use of bounded accuracy inside of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, do I think this problem is insurmountable? Of course not. As I've said, my group has had a ton of success with Pathfinder 2e. This is, hands down, my favorite role-playing game. But I can see where it would be a struggle for different groups and different players, and so the next two videos in this series are going to be my advice and suggestions to help people who are encountering this particular frustration. So, in the next video, I'm going to speak specifically to players. I'm going to offer you some advice, some tips, some things to keep in mind, some things to be aware of that will hopefully help you avoid becoming frustrated or bored with the gameplay of Pathfinder 2e. And then in the third video, I'm going to specifically talk to game masters, and I'm going to offer some advice as someone who has sat behind the GM screen and give you some suggestions on things that you can do to hopefully help your group experience more success. But I realize I've been talking for a while now. This is my opening statement, and I'm pretty sure this video is going to end up just under an hour long, so I should probably go ahead and cut this video here. Let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts? Is Pathfinder 2e too hard? If it is too hard, why is it too hard? What specific elements of the game are creating frustration and leading people to not have fun at their gaming table? And what are the best ways to fix it? Do you agree with my analysis? Do you think that the bounded accuracy of Pathfinder 2e is the problem that people are encountering? Or do you think that there is something else that I've left out of the conversation that is contributing to the problem? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like it and share it. Subscribe to the channel. As I said, I've got 2 more videos in this series, and I'm sorry that my Starfinder review got interrupted again, but I promise you it is recorded. I will get it edited. I will get it out. I just kind of got sidetracked this week. But definitely subscribe to the channel because there is more content coming out. Thank you for joining me, and have a wonderful day.